When I first started graduate school, one of my interests was in slavery and race in New England. And so I got turned on to this project dealing with slavery, race, and religion in colonial Newport, Rhode Island. You know, people, whenever they talk about Newport, they talk about the mansions, but Newport has a really long history in colonial America that involves slavery and the slave trade. So in the process of researching and writing this work, I found out about these two missionaries who were African slaves. They got their freedom through a winning lottery ticket, and then they were sent to the College of New Jersey to be trained underneath this president named John Witherspoon, who's this very well-known kind of famous guy in the 18th century. And I just thought that this was a really fascinating story because you know, missionaries in general, for me, were very interesting and fascinating, but also the idea that in the 18th century, there are these black missionaries who are being trained to go back to Africa, quote unquote, back to Africa, to spread the gospel was a really interesting story. For them, the revolution intervened. One of them, a guy named John Kwaku, was a privateer during the American Revolution. He ended up dying, and so he never ended up going back to Africa, and the mission just kind of failed and died out. But my interest was really piqued in these types of stories. My interest turned from being about Newport to these larger evangelical circles and these larger concerns about missionaries. And the simple question I had was, how many more of them are there really out there? And so once I started to really get into this type of project and this type of idea, I really just started counting, you know, how many black missionaries, how many missionaries in West Africa, how many Native American missionaries, and nobody had really told this story before. I think for me, what I wanted to do was to explore something that connected African American history with the history of religion, the history of Native Americans with the history of the Atlantic world, the history of empire and colonialism and those types of things. And this type of project was a perfect way for me to try to do that. Black and Indian missionaries were common for a couple of reasons. I think the first and most basic reason is because of language. The language barrier was absolutely critical and problematic for missionaries who are going into these, you know, sometimes unknown, sometimes somewhat known spaces. And scholars often talk about translation as kind of a twofold process. On the one hand, there's translating a word, just kind of giving its meaning and just trying to get a sense of what the word means. But there's also translating concepts. So Native peoples didn't have any idea of the Trinity, or they didn't have any word for original sin. You know, to say that they were born in sin is something that was kind of strange to them. And so Native missionaries were able to do this kind of translational work of literally translating words, but also translating concepts into indigenous terms, whether it's in Africa or whether it's among slaves in South Carolina or whether it was among Iroquois Indians in New York. The other advantage that they had, that a lot of British missionaries had perceived in them, was that they were cheaper. And this is kind of the darker and dirtier side of the missionary business, but they paid Native missionaries a lot less. There were organizations that acted as actuaries, and they actually did the calculations of trying to figure out how much missionaries would cost. And it turned out that it would cost maybe 120 pounds to bring a missionary to London, to bring a Native person to London to train them as a missionary, and then you could send them back to Iroquois or somewhere, you know, New England or something like that. And you could pay them maybe 40 pounds a year or something like that. So there's a big outlay of money right at the beginning, but if you paid a white missionary, if you paid an English missionary, you would have to pay them more because they demanded a higher salary, but you also needed an interpreter as well. And so it was a larger outlay of money to get Native missionaries involved, but they believed that it was actually a better investment, you know. There were other ways in which they were cheaper as well, because there were a bunch of different levels of missionaries. Some of them were ordained ministers who were official figures and characters within their churches. Some of them were school teachers and catechists and psalm singers and other types of influential people who got paid significantly less, you know, maybe 7 pounds a year or something like that. And so the cost is really one advantage that they see in this. The final thing, and this is actually what I found really interesting, is that the same types of racialized ideas that were really kind of germinating and sprouting up in the 17th and 18th centuries, these things motivated the need for native missionaries. There was a sense that among Indians out on the frontier or out in the borderlands, that this land was a kind of uncultivated wilderness, a very difficult land in terms of the climate and a tough place to live, and that native missionaries would be perfectly suited to go out there because, you know, white English missionaries, not only would they not want the jobs, but they simply couldn't survive in that type of climate, in that kind of place. In Africa, there's a really similar kind of dynamic going on where you have the need for African missionaries because of the particular climatological and epidemiological conditions of Africa. Africa really was a white man's grave for a lot of English colonists, traders, missionaries, and others. And so there was a belief that Africans had bodies that were particularly well suited to going out into the African climate and the African environment. And what's interesting and ironic about that is that's the same type of justification, the same type of rhetoric and logic that justified slavery, you know. So, you know, the same type of idea that justified slavery, that, you know, African bodies were, quote unquote, particularly well suited for labor, for hard work in exotic climates, was the same kind of rhetoric and logic that gave native African missionaries an opportunity to try to gain some spiritual authority through evangelical Christianity. So for scholars who work in early American history, I mean, that is the perennial problem for us, is that we have limited sources. For anybody working in 17th and 18th century America, there's really not a lot out there, just kind of in general. So that's the starting point, is that, you know, you're lucky if you find anything on any topic that you're researching. One of the interesting things I found is that, you know, missionaries write a lot, you know. They write letters to other missionaries and to their sponsor organizations to explain what's going on in the mission field. They write publications that ask for more money and sponsors and funding and things like that. There's this one organization, the Society for Propagating the Gospel in Foreign Parts, which is an Anglican organization that comes out in 1701. Somebody else, Travis Glasson, who's actually a Rhode Island guy, lived over by LaSalle, wrote a book called Mastering Christianity, which is about this particular group. And they're kind of a slice of my larger project. But I looked at all of their records, all of their pamphlets, all of their sermons and everything. One of the really interesting things they did is that every year they would have an anniversary sermon where they would talk about the progress of the gospel, and they would kind of talk about it in rhetorical terms and just kind of painting a broad picture of what it looked like. But then at the end of the sermon, which they would print and send off to all of their missionary colleagues throughout the Atlantic world, at the end of the sermon there would be kind of a 20 or 30 page summary of things that happened that year. So every single year you can chart where native missionaries are, how much they're getting paid, what are some of the conflicts and issues, how are they in connection with other peoples, and that's just one kind of group of sources. And so, you know, for me, looking at missionary sources, I initially thought that I really wouldn't have a lot, but then it was kind of overload. I mean, I almost had too much. The other thing I would say too, in addition to the amount of printed sources, is there's a lot of manuscript materials as well, handwritten materials. Missionaries who were Black and Native American who converted to Christianity often had schooling by Western educators, and so they would learn English. A lot of times they would learn Latin, and they would write these letters, these handwritten letters, to sponsor organizations or to patrons or other groups. And so we actually have dozens of letters from various Native missionaries working in West Africa or New York or New England and all these other places. And so I think it ended up being a surprisingly large number of sources between the printed material and the manuscript material. And I think at the end of the day, my decision was to basically reread the entire history of missionaries from the 17th to the 18th centuries. And that involved a lot of work, but it also produced, I think, really good results too. Well, I found that one of the ways that I want to structure my book was to talk about these individual stories and try to flesh out these stories in as much detail as possible. And there are a lot of really compelling and interesting stories in the book, but I think that for me, the one that really struck a chord with me, and I'm not entirely sure why, but is the story of a man named Philip Kwaku. Philip Kwaku was an African who lived in Ghana in the middle of the 18th century. And he was a child of a pretty well-to-do kind of trading elite family, and he got sent to England in the middle of the 1750s to be trained as a missionary. This was basically a fate that was decided for him by his uncles and grandparents and things like that. He went along with 2 other Africans, one of whom died shortly after, and I think one of whom apparently went insane. But Philip Kwaku made it, and he stayed in London for 10 years, becoming an anglicized African, walking the streets of London, walking in the shadow of St. Paul's, learning how to be a missionary. He got ordained as a missionary. He married an English woman and then went back to Ghana, Cape Coast Castle, in 1766 as a missionary. And the more that I researched him, the more I realized how isolating the process could be, right? He was a missionary who was sponsored by this Anglican organization, the Society for Propagating the Gospel in Foreign Parts. So half of his salary was paid by this organization. The other half, however, was paid by this organization called the Company for Merchants Trading in Africa, and these were basically slave traders. And so you have this very strange connection between evangelism and evangelical efforts and the slave trade, right, where his salary is being paid by both organizations. The goal for him, going back to Africa, was to be a chaplain to the English traders and merchants who were living at Cape Coast Castle. But the other goal was so that he could propagate the gospel to Africans living in that area as well. And he left about a couple dozen letters that he sent to people across the Atlantic, to his Anglican sponsors back in London, to people all kind of throughout the Atlantic world that detail his experiences and his challenges, his frustrated hopes in trying to convert Africans to Christianity, and in trying to deal with the slave traders who he thought were leading an incredibly licentious and evil kind of lifestyle. And he was very much against the slave trade, but it's unclear whether he was against slavery. So he had these really kind of complicated ideas about what it meant to be an African living in this place. And he worked there from 1766 to 1816. So he was there for 50 years at the heart of the slave trade. He witnessed the period that saw the end of the slave trade. He witnessed a period of a tremendous amount of upheaval about the slave trade. He lived through a revolutionary age. He wrote to a lot of people kind of, again, throughout the Atlantic world, trying to foster these connections. One of the interesting stories that I start out with at the beginning of the book is another well-known African, although there's a debate about whether he's African, that's another whole story. Again, a guy named Olaudah Equiano. And Equiano was kind of an 18th century Frederick Douglass. A lot of people read Equiano in high school and in college. And Equiano, towards the end of the 18th century, applies to be a missionary back to Africa. He wants to be this Christian evangelical and go back there. And he says, this would be a good thing to do because Philip Kwaku was successful, back in Africa. And he's citing this guy who was already there. He didn't know his history very well because if Equiano read the accounts, Kwaku was not terribly successful. In fact, he only baptized a few people, and his life was a really frustrating life. But it's really interesting to think that this really celebrated transatlantic evangelical, somebody who's an abolitionist, Equiano, would cite Philip Kwaku as this kind of a person who is inspiring to lead an evangelical life. I think the big takeaway for the entire project is to really kind of complicate the lines between colonialism and religion, I think. For me, going back to the various paradigms of thinking about missionaries, for me it's really important to understand on the ground how complex these things were. I never wanted to, and nor did I intend to write an apology for missionaries or anything like that, but I do want to understand why these people acted the way they did. And I think that looking at Native missionaries, looking at Black and Indian missionaries, West Africans who converted to Christianity, Native Americans who started to live in praying towns, other Native Americans who went from New England to New York to try to convert those Native Americans living in New York, all these various peoples, I think it demonstrates that the relationship between religion and empire is a lot more complicated than we think. I think we traditionally assume that religion and empire kind of go hand in hand. That's the term that we call cultural imperialism. But for a lot of Native peoples, they appropriate and use Christianity for their own purposes, and really for their own ends and for their own goals. And I think that's the important thing that I really want to emphasize, that these people kind of grasped onto Christianity and saw in evangelical Christianity an answer to some of the challenges and the questions that they had in their lives. At the same time, however, I think I really want to problematize their situations. They lived very, very difficult lives. A lot of times they were, abysmally poor and socially isolated. The Philip Kwaku example is a good example of that. I mean, he was not a terribly happy man during the end of the 18th and into the beginning of the 19th century. He was incredibly frustrated with his bosses, with the people who supported him, with the Africans who wouldn't convert. So it was a tough lifestyle, and it was certainly not one to be glorified in any way, shape, or form. But for them, they felt like they were making these decisions because it would better their community and better their people.